So the title of the next bit is, Can Art Save Us? And my own knee-jerk response was no. But then I thought about what activates us and what things have activated me. I've mentioned before Richard Powers' novel, The Overstory, which it was a major reason I became a climate writer. President Obama said it changed the way he looked at the world. And in a way, art has already saved us. I don't know if people remember the 1983 TV movie, The Day After, about nuclear war between the US and Russia. Ronald Reagan wrote in his diary that he saw it, he was greatly depressed by it. He wanted to do all we can to have a deterrent and to see to it that there is never nuclear war. So narratives, stories, obviously, they pack a punch. And so to start this next session, I'm going to ask you to clap again if you'd like, about creative works that might have impacted the way you see climate. Clap your hands if any of these things are true for you. If there's been, so the first question is, has there been a work of art, book, film, poem, that has changed how you thought about climate? Has anyone been inspired by a book or documentary to make a lifestyle change? Does anyone, for anyone, is this true? Fiction plays no role in your real world actions. So one person, okay. All right, okay, so we're all set up here. So you should all have the note cards, again, write down any queries, or actually for this one, write down any titles of any artworks, books, films, poems that have spurred you into action, or just made you look at things a bit differently. And just pass the cards to the roving producers. And we also asked readers of the New York Times California Today newsletter in advance of this event. Here are just a couple of things that readers sent in. Kathleen from Nevada City, California said she was impacted by Don't Look Up, which is, of course, the film by Adam McKay that came out last year. Was it last year? What is time anymore in this post-pandemic world? And Linda from Santa Rosa, California said Disney's Fantasia really impacted her, specifically the segment based on Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which illustrates the rise of life on Earth. So this is what we're going to explore with our next guests, the role of imagination in how we approach problems as intractable and overwhelming as the climate crisis. So I'm going to bring up three people who they've really looked at this through different kinds of imaginative storytelling. First, we have Louie, the documentary filmmaker. He won an Oscar for his film, The Cove, and you might have seen some of his more recent films, Racing Extinction and The Game Changers, which turned a lot of people onto a plant-based diet. He's also the executive director of the Oceanic Preservation Society. Ayana Jamieson, an expert on someone who was writing climate stories before any of the big sci-fi names we hear about today. She's an Octavia Butler scholar, and she's founder of the Octavia Butler Legacy Network and teaches ethnic studies at California State University, Polytech, Pomona. And Katharine Wilkinson is the co-editor of All We Can Save. It's a collection of essays, art, and poetry focused on solutions to the climate crisis. She was also the lead writer of the best-selling book, Drawdown. Serious business up here on stage. So, Katharine, we're going to start with you. All We Can Save intersperses essays with poems by people like Ada Lamon, Joy Harjo, more than a dozen others. So when you set out to put together this book, were you immediately like, poetry, we must have poetry? And how did poetry end up in the volume?
So it turns out it is very hard to sell a climate anthology. Publishers will say nobody buys climate books, nobody buys anthologies. I think if we had said we would also like to put poetry in this climate anthology, it never would have found a home. But in all seriousness, we just didn't think about it when we pitched this book, my co-editor, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, and I. But as we were bringing it to life and collecting 40 essays by women leading on climate in all different ways, I just had a moment where I was like, this book is not going to be complete if it doesn't have poetry, because so much of this book is about a different way of coming to this topic with our whole selves, not just our heads, but also our hearts. And it was about creating a kaleidoscopic perspective, right? Not a single lens for understanding, as the subtitle says, truth, courage, and solutions for the climate crisis, but a book that kind of continues to turn the kaleidoscope. And the poems play such a critical role in helping us feel our feelings, creating these moments to sort of pause and breathe and process. And I actually think they have everything to do with what made this book kind of a surprise success.
And you said that even when you, was it you or somebody who was reading the book, even for yourself, you said, some days I just can't take another essay, like, you needed a break. Was that something that you felt personally?
It was a reader, who shared, some days I just cannot do another essay. Like, I cannot do another sort of prefrontal cortex take on the climate crisis. And on those days, I open this book and I read a poem. And I will say for myself, the things that I go back to the most often in this collection are the poems, and also the beautiful sort of poem comics by Madeline Jubilee Saito.
Well, let's hear a poem. Let's hear a poem, shall we? Yes. I think this is Ada Lamon's Dead Stars.
Yeah, in honor of our new poet laureate.
Poet laureate.
Out here, there's a bowing even the trees are doing. Winter's icy hand at the back of all of us. Black bark, slick yellow leaves, a kind of stillness that feels so mute it's almost in another year. I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. We point out the stars that make Orion as we take out the trash, the rolling containers, a song of suburban thunder. It's almost romantic as we adjust the waxy blue recycling bin until you say, man, we should really learn some new constellations. And it's true. We keep forgetting about Antlia, Centaurus, Draco, Lacerda, Hydra, Lyra, Lynx. But mostly, we're forgetting we're dead stars too. My mouth is full of dust, and I wish to reclaim the rising, to lean in the spotlight of streetlight with you toward what's larger within us, toward how we were born. Look, we are not unspectacular things. We've come this far, survived this much. What would happen if we decided to survive more, to love harder? What if we stood up with our synapses and flesh and said no, no to the rising tides, stood for the many mute mouths of the sea, of the land? What would happen if we used our bodies to bargain for the safety of others, for Earth? If we declared a clean night, if we stopped being terrified, if we launched our demands into the sky, made ourselves so big, people could point to us with the arrows they make in their minds, rolling their trash bins out after all of this is over.
Nice, thank you, that was beautiful. Thank you, and Louie, jumping to you. Your art, and your heart is in the realm of nonfiction, but your films have had a really big influence on people's actions. So can you talk a little bit about how you transitioned, the impact your Oscar-winning film, The Cove, had, and then why you changed the way you were telling stories and ended up doing a film like The Game Changers, which was a game changer?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say 15 years ago when we started working on The Cove, the narrative was just try to create awareness. That was it. That was enough. You know, and to have a point of view was frowned upon. So we made The Cove, and you know the action was pretty obvious, I think, from it. But it was you know, they were killing 23. People haven't seen it. They were killing 23,000 dolphins and porpoises every year in Japan for human consumption. And the film was extremely effective at getting those numbers way down. I think last year or the year before it was 1,610. So it was down 93% because of the action that caused. But I'd say that 9 out of 10 people that have heard of it didn't see it because it has this feeling like, oh, I can't see that. And it's, it's one of the most winning documentaries in film history. It's, the first film in history to sweep all the film guilds, but people didn't see it. So it was really crushing, had impact. And then, when you work 5 years on a film and people don't want to see it, it changed my attitude. And also I think the culture's attitude changed quite a bit too. So, people wanted to know what kind of action can I take?
Right.
And with the Game Changers, it was like so clear to me, it's not just about eating dolphins, it's about eating animals. If there's one thing, we heard about today that everybody can do is change what's on your plate to a more plant-based diet.
I just want to jump in have people seen The Game Changers, this film on Netflix? So it's a film, it is so well done. It's about all the ways it's about plant-based athletes and how they kick ass because they're plant-based. And one of the people Louie interviews is the world's strongest man. And the quote is in the trailer. He's like, people say to me, you're strong as an ox. How can you just eat plants? And he says, what does an ox eat? And so I knew something was happening because all these people were coming back from Sundance where it aired, and they were all of a sudden saying, I'm vegan, I'm plant-based. I was like, you just came from Sundance. And the film is all about that, how being plant-based impacts you, like, how it's good for your teeth, your digestion, your health, your male performative skill, like all of this stuff was all covered in the film, and it had this huge impact, and it was
it
quite
probably
profound.
saved more animals than any one piece of art ever, but we didn't talk about the cruelty that's being done to animals by eating them. It just talks about it purely from a selfish point of view. It's better for your personal health.
Right.
And we talk about the climate issues too, but the narrative was the formula that we stumbled onto, and it was really a scientific method because there's a group called the Vegan Mafia who, said, hey, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these issues. And
Is there really a group called
what's that?
There's really, what do you?
Well, informally, it's not like they have their badges or anything or little hoodies with,
They would be based out here, though, if anywhere, right?
a lot of them are on the East Coast.
Oh.
But they had a white paper, and in the white paper they said, well, it was stuck in vegetarianism, veganism was stuck in low single digits. And they said, okay, we're dumping all this money. It's not a matter of another ad, another anything. What's the problem? Men were the obstacle. Men were marketed to very heavily that to be strong, have endurance and virility. They were told by advertising that you had to have animal products.
Right.
And so they issued another white paper that said, well, then the findings came back and said, well, men will listen to athletes. And so we had, one of the world's strongest guys, Patrick Baboumian, carried more weight than anybody in history. Scott Jurek, who ran the Appalachian Trail, most people take 6 months to walk it. He ran it in I can't remember, 44 days. And we did this. You have to see it. We basically test a collegiate athlete's virility with this test we took. It's called a Rigiscan test. And anyway, the upshot is that men had a 10.4% larger erection with a plant-based diet and a 350% longer duration erection on a plant-based diet after one meal.
We went there.
Well, here's the cool part. But the first 30 days that film was on Netflix, plant-based diet shot up, searches for plant-based diet shot up 350% worldwide. It had a huge effect, and it just keeps on going. Ethan Brown, who, I had met before, but he forgot it. But I introduced myself to him. He gave me the biggest hug because his business went way up after that film.
Yeah, amazing. Yep, changing narratives, powerful. Ayana, I wanted to ask, the amazing narration of Octavia Butler. So for people who aren't familiar with her, can you give an overview of who she is and why her work is so relevant to climate change?
Sure. So Octavia Butler was born June 22nd, 1947 in what she calls Jim Crow, California. And today we heard about the MacArthur grants. She was a MacArthur grantee in the 1990s. She's the first science fiction writer to have that award. And she began publishing in the 1970s. Ironically, when you were talking about the quote from Ronald Reagan, she actually was writing in response to talking about climate change very early and doing research very early because of something Reagan said, which was that we could have a winnable nuclear war. So basically, she would read the news and do research and then dialogue with those policies that were going to get us into trouble. And so she wrote 15 books that she published, essays she would write for the UN on climate change. And she's just a very entertaining, beautiful, sexy writer with lots of wonderful fiction that people enjoy. And climate change and climate refugees figure into these novels called The Parable of the Talents and The Parable of the Sower, in which a presidential candidate famously says, let's make America great again. And these novels were written in the 1990s. And so people ask me, like, Ayana, why does it seem like she was predicting the future?
And what do you say?
I say that she would tell you that she's not predicting the future, that she, like her protagonist, Lauren Oya Olamina, is just looking around and observing the things that she sees and then talking about them. And that's what Butler did from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Before anyone was talking about climate change, she knew that these were issues that she would extrapolate the known and say, if this goes on, this is what we're going to be left with.
And, you know, to that point, before she died in 2006, she had been writing since the 80s, but her first book, it didn't appear in the bestseller list till 2020, is that right?
Yes, she was writing since the 1970s.
1970s.
But her book, Parable of the Sower, was on the New York Times bestseller list September 2020, in the heat of the pandemic.
Why do you think that was?
Because people started looking at that artwork and realizing that it was not just entertainment and not just a warning, but maybe a way and a blueprint, something that activists like those young persons that were here earlier, a blueprint for how to live in community and solve issues, and not just one-up one another, consume, 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 but what happens when you can no longer do those things. And direct response to some legislation that Pete Wilson signed into law that would have barred undocumented people from public education, emergency rooms, and other services. It was eventually ruled unconstitutional, but Octavia thought, well, if we have uneducated sick people in hordes roaming around, how is that gonna look? And that's how she sets the stage for that book. And this is essentially the exact situation we were in with COVID-19.
It's amazing. I mean, have people read The Parable of the Sower? It's an amazing work, yeah. And it sort of talks about, you know, like the connection that we have between imagination and reality and how that can really narrow, like with Octavia Butler. But also, Katharine, I wanted to ask you, do you see a link between like what we can imagine and like policies that we can put in place? And do you feel it, how does narrative and how we shape the story play into that?
Totally. Well, first of all, it's interesting. This book came out in September 2020 and became a surprise bestseller. So I don't know what was in the air or the water or what at that time, other than COVID. But yeah, I mean, I think when we look at other social movements, other movements for political change, narrative change and cultural change always comes first, right? It always sets the terms of what is possible. It taps into imagination for different ways that we could construct the world that we're living in. It rarely ever follows political change, technological change, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, I think for a long time in the climate space, it's been sort of like, oh, sure, yeah, comms, great, that seems important, maybe. And actually, I think this is such a critical strategic tool, particularly when so much of climate discourse to this point, and this is so very much in your work, Cara, has been about the futures that we want to avoid, right? The horrors that may be headed our way and are already at our doorsteps. we have a very hard time imagining the future that we do want and that is still possible. And I think that is where art and storytelling and sort of cultural mediums of all stripes have such a critical role to play.
I absolutely agree. I just want to read a couple of responses from the audience about things that have resonated with them. One, of course, was Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. I've only read it, I was only halfway through it, and I thought they're not going to let me into San Francisco because I figured everyone here had read it. And also Kiss the Ground, which is a documentary about regenerative agriculture. Louie, you've found a lot of connection between moving people viscerally with the image, but not just on the screen, on projections. Can you tell me a little bit about that work and how that's yielded policy change? And then we'll cue it up in a second after you answer.
Yeah, no, thanks. You know, there's some really good evidence that shows the science of social change. You need 10% of the population 100% committed to create, you know, let's say, a suffragette movement, Arab Spring, civil rights movement, works with just about anything. And even a great documentary isn't going to reach 700 million people, which is, you know, roughly 800,000 people, or 800 million people, the 10% of the population of planet Earth. But we had this dream that we could reach 1 billion people with these projection events. So I did this film called Racing Extinction, which was about the Anthropocene, the fifth mass extinction that we're going through. And we thought, Discovery put it on their network and they showed it. They basically turned that film over to all their channels for a weekend. And on the first day, it had like 38 million people. But before that, we thought, even if they blow it out of the water, we're never going to get 1 billion people. But we thought, if we do a projection event, if we project endangered species on an edifice that everybody can recognize, it'll be like the bat signal for, you know, for the what's going on with animal life. We're set to lose, you know, 1 million species by the end of this decade, or the end of this century. So I had this dream to project endangered species on the Empire State Building with a couple of friends of mine. And it sounded like a really crazy idea, and our distributor said, well, you know, it's like in New York in the summertime, it gets dark late. All the important people will be in the Hamptons or over in Europe. The media won't show up because they can't afford overtime. It'll be a non-event. Well, we did it anyway, and we had 939 million media views within 5 days. We had, you know, people were lined up down Fifth Avenue like it was the Easter parade. You know, we thought we could, you know, we had almost 1 billion people, and we thought we couldn't do any better than we did. And then the Pope called. And the Pope, this is right before COP21, why world leaders were at, remember he was named after St. Francis of Assisi. And he wanted to project endangered species on the Vatican during COP21. And then we had 4.4 billion media views. So I guess we could roll the clip.
Yes, let's roll the clip.
I'm not sure what we're going to see.
Yeah,
hopefully some of that.
We're going to see a short video of something related to what you said, hopefully. Let's take a look. Can we roll the clip of it's going to happen? Okay. Beautiful.
But, thanks. So now we're working with the United Nations to do a projection on the east side of the Secretariat building. And what we found by doing these projections, it's not just the projection, it's what you're projecting it on. When you project species on the Empire State Building, it says, hey, this is important as the commerce. And so that building, the UN represents the one building in the world where people come together, world leaders come together to define what's going to be happening, you know, within the next year. So next year during the climate, or when world leaders meet for the General Assembly, we want to project on the east side of the building with the New York skyline in the background. And then we had, I think, 250,000 people watching that projection event that you just saw. And then even like if COVID's still a problem a year from now, you can get easily several 100,000 people on Gantry State Park in Queens looking at that event. So we're just raising up financing right now to do that. And I think easily, we know we can get people's attention, and now we can do sound, so you can actually listen through your iPhone and see, let's say, Greta, on the building, or, the size of Godzilla, and you can see, basically climate activists like we're doing it here right now, but I think we could reach easily billions of people and create the action that we're all talking about here.
And it's beautiful to see them, it's very moving, but what impact does it have on policy?
Well, I mean, when we did those last projection events, we also projected on buildings all up and down the west coast of the United States. And so unfortunately, the same election that got us Donald Trump, we also worked to get endangered species protected in all 4 western states, because at that time there was loopholes that allowed endangered species to be trafficked on the west coast of America. So we closed up all those loopholes by doing projections on edifices like in Portland and in California and Washington State and Hawaii. And then we got signatures, like people get riled up and they go out and get enough signatures to get on a referendum to get on the ballot. So we're saving, depending on the state, 10 to 12 of the most endangered species that were being trafficked to America closed up because of that one film.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm going to shift again to Octavia Butler, who was so prescient 30 or 40 years ago. The parable of the sower, did you find it like a little depressing? Like when you interact with it, do you find hope in her work, even though she's presenting a very bleak story about what is now the time? She wrote about 2023, wasn't it?
2024 is when the book starts.
Right.
And we are a little bit ahead of that in our timeline. But for me, I don't find that her work is depressing. I find it hopeful. I actually have children who are the same age as the protagonist in this book. In this book, they were having school in their living rooms. And Lauren Olamina was born in 2009. My child was born in 2010. So for me, not to say that everyone must have children, but for me, I think about raising Olamina and the potential that they have and how I can facilitate a sense of hope and wonder in them. I have a child who wants to be a farmer. I don't know why, but this is in his soul, right? That he wants to be a farmer. That's one of the things he wants to be. And I think because I read science fiction and I find hope in fiction, and fiction is always ahead of policymakers, it's ahead of scholars, it's ahead of, it's right along with activists. I find it to be hopeful and exciting because it's not only disaster that she is pointing to, but also how communities survive in these circumstances, because many of us are already surviving apocalypse in terms of genocide and sex trafficking of human beings and unequal distribution of resources and education. So I find it hopeful that she's given us a model, and many activists say they're inspired by her work, and I continue to be inspired by her work.
So can you talk about some of the themes in her stories that allow people to imagine possibilities and paradigms that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise? And you also mentioned queer ecology, if you could tie that in.
Sure, and folks have been referring to queer ecology throughout the day, but basically I'll start with queer ecology in that my understanding of it as an ethnic studies professor and science fiction nerd is that some of the ways that we have prescribed that nature behaves is actually not the way it really behaves when we observe it outside of the patriarchal paradigm in which nature is being projected onto by those virile men who are encouraged to eat meat, right? So queer ecology says, like, what are the things that are already happening in nature that are non-hierarchical or not binary or not along an either or, and looks at those things as phenomena in and of themselves. And then in terms of her work, there's themes, yes, climate change, but also something called hyperempathy syndrome, which is basically, in our timeline, clinicians have found that it's an overactive limbic system in which when you see someone else hurting or experience pleasure or pain, those same centers in your brain are being fired. But in the novel, what Butler calls it is a biological conscience. And that's basically what we need in order to think about climate change. It's not just envisioning the world that you want to see, right? But also accepting what are some of the things that you're willing to give up in order to make space in your life, in order to manifest the love of other folks and the planet as equal, not as something you dominate, conquer, and manipulate. And I find that to be extremely encouraging. You know, it's like the practicality and real life Star Trek work, not just like, oh, racism went away, oh, we don't need money anymore. But no, how do we farm? How do we sustain ourselves? How do we write, there's poetry in Parable of the Sower. How do we keep those traditions alive that have been ignored? And that's why I love her work.
I mean, yes, there's so much resilience in her books as well. Like, there's a real ferocity, like a real will to live, as well as, you know, like the scary stuff, but we can handle it all. We can handle the scary stuff as well. Katharine, I wanted to ask you, you know, when you brought the book out and there were essays and then the poetry that you interspersed within it, did you see that helped people, move people into action, or was it more a balm that they were able to sort of have space around, like Tara Brach spoke of earlier today?
Yeah. To me, if we don't feel our feelings about the climate crisis, we get paralyzed, right? In anxiety, grief, shame, like there's a whole set of emotions that have been referenced throughout the day. But when we are willing to feel our feelings, they can become this incredible source of fuel, of motivation, deep sources of knowledge, actually, right? And I think poetry helps to take us there. I mean, it helps to take us there across so many dimensions of the human experience. And the same is true for our relationship to this earth that we call home. And I think it brings us into a sense of, you know, who we actually are, right? Which is that we are hardwired for reciprocal relationship with one another and for the living systems of this planet, and the non or beyond human world. And so I think there's like a movement, you know, sort of an emotional movement that poetry helps to facilitate that almost necessarily precedes helpful, effective movement in the outer world, if you will. And I think, you know, when I think about my own journey in climate work, which started with student activism when I was in high school, you know, I saw my first clear cut in a national forest at the same time that I started reading Mary Oliver's poetry, at the same time that I became vegetarian. Like, it was sort of this constellation of, you know, a deeper analysis of what was happening around me, a deeper tapping into what I was feeling about all of it, and then, you know, beginning to find my little footholds of action, and often having that happen in community. And maybe that's just one thing to add about this book, is that we really wanted it not just to be a reflection of the community that is rising to meet this moment, but also a way to seed and grow it. So when the book was coming out, I designed a set of resources called All We Can Save Circles, which is sort of a, you know, it's a book club sort of riff, if you will, but it's a 10-session small group journey that goes through each section of this book, having space for deeper and more generous dialogue than we often have about this topic, and to build trust and relationship, and to do some of that emotional processing that then can lead to action. And that's what we have heard from people who have done the Circles experience, not only that they've built community that is sustaining and nourishing them over time, but that it is sparking all kinds of action. And for folks who've been in the work for a long time, they're finding, you know, a kind of reinvigoration. And for people who are newer to the topic or just finding their place, feeling welcomed in and having, you know, a sense that they belong. And that, to me, is at the heart of our prospects for whatever better world is possible, that the we in all we can save is absolutely vital. And if we're not attending to that with care and focus, we can have all the best tools and technologies and plans in the world, and we won't get there.
Right, and the we being about connection and having faith in other humans, which if you go down a rabbit hole, as I have gone down, what's happening with species and the destruction, you can be like, oh, I hate people, and it's a really tight space to be in, and you have to, and Louie, you made a film that helped, I'm sure it was about the Dalai Lama's friendship with Bishop Desmond Tutu, that helped break that down, I'm sure, for a lot of people, just realizing, we can have faith in other people. We can't, instead of being like, you person over there, you're doing these horrible things, right? Was that a balm for you to make that film?
Yeah, no, it was a great anecdote to everything, because I was getting, despair from humanity. And then I happened to be sitting next to the writer and publisher of this book who did a book on the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, and he said, we filmed it, and do you think it could be made into a documentary? He had 4.5 days with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. It was like a crash course in how to be human with two of the greatest spiritual leaders of our generation. And after watching it, I just felt myself transformed, because I realized that I do love people. I do have compassion, and it's not just about trying to save animals and the environment for future generations. It's about trying to, inspire everybody else to help save ourselves, and creating that sense of community. And those two, that film just really, and doing that film, the act of doing it and listening to their words was really transformational. It just changed my life. It was like chiropractic for the soul.
Nice, nice, excellent. So we have an audience question from Caroline on my left, I think. There's Caroline on my left.
Thanks, hi. Really grateful, excuse me, for this side of the conversation. As a former high school English teacher who actually designed a class teaching All We Can Save and Parable of the Sower together last year, this is very exciting for me. And I'm curious, since so much of the day has been dedicated to climate tech, and many of us live in the Bay Area, what do you feel is something that the climate tech space could really learn from climate art or literature right now, if you had to share one lesson?
Ayana, you're up.
My parents may be watching, but I want to say that it's not only in science fiction, and it's not only in works that are intentionally geared toward climate change, but also in other genres. Like, the most compelling arguments about fixing climate change for me in the last couple of years have been in romance novels of all places. Thinking about, this is maybe not a main part of the book, but nonetheless, these very women-centered and people-centered and body-centered narratives are thinking about what happens to the environment, and that's a kind of joy technology that maybe we haven't tapped into, I think. And it's a place where you wouldn't think that it would show up. I've been surprised by that, but also extremely excited that my worlds are overlapping in such a beautiful way. And also, no paper books in the house with young children. Ebooks, but yes, that's what I think.
That's what you think. How about, you guys?
Well, what's the question? I don't think I quite understand it.
What do you want the tech bros to know?
What the tech bros? Well, that's what I thought you said, but I was like, the tech bros are my main supporters. I mean, I think they get it. I mean, seriously. I mean, I sat next to Josh Tetrick, who's runs Just. The food people get it. The car people get it. Those are the people that support our work. I don't have any issues at all about it. I think what we're losing right now more than anything is, we have the technology of what we need to save the planet right now, and it really is about community. It's about bonding together against the biggest foe that we've ever fought. All the wars ever fought will be a footnote in history compared to what we're up against right now. We just have to bond together, mobilize, and do the hard work that needs to be done. And this is confronting what we're putting on our plates, the energy we're using, and we need to direct our politicians to do the right thing. They're waiting for us. We need to lead the politicians.
All right, and Katharine, you have the last word.
Wow. Well, I'll just maybe close with the words of Audrey and Rich. For those who were in our workshop earlier on climate wayfinding, you know these, but it feels like the right place to conclude. And this is the closing stanza of her poem, Natural Resources, which inspired the title of this book, which otherwise would have had a very bad title based on the spreadsheet of possibilities we had rolling. And Rich writes, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." And I think that focus on the big we, with no extraordinary power, no investors, no Silicon Valley hoopla, like it is the big, big tent that we need to do this work, and we should make it as welcoming and leaderful as we possibly can.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you, Katharine. Thank you, Louie. Thank you, Ayana.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.